On Kooperativnaya Street in Chapayevsk, everyone had known him since childhood. He grew up just a few houses down, walked past these yards every day, and greeted the neighbors. When the search would begin, he would be among the first to come out and help. But that moment was still hours away. For now, it was August 11th, 2024, an ordinary summer evening in a small industrial town on the outskirts of Samara Oblast. Chapayevsk is a place of chemical plants, private houses, and a river. A town where everyone knows everyone, where life has followed the same pattern for decades. Kooperativnaya Street, old houses, vegetable gardens, quiet evenings. Grandmother Svetlana Nozhnikova was tending to her garden beds, picking cucumbers. Miroslava, who had just turned 2, was running around the yard nearby. She knew every corner, every bush. This yard was her entire world. Yulia Prokaeva had left for her shift that morning. She worked as an operator at an ozone warehouse. Besides the grandmother, her younger son, Miroslava's uncle, was also home. Their yard was completely open, with no fence. There was no one to build one, and no money for it either. From the street side, the property was visible from end to end, while on the other side, an overgrown path led through to neighboring houses. One house over stood an abandoned building, long uninhabited, its roof caved in. The owners had bought the land years ago, but were in no hurry to demolish it. Locals avoided the place. Only the occasional drinker wandered in. Anyone could walk onto a neighbor's property, but that evening, no one was thinking about that. And then a neighbor approached the gate, the same one everyone here had known since childhood. Sergei Vashchenko, 36, lived one house over with his sister Natalia. On Kooperativnaya, people remembered him as a little boy. He'd grown up right here, never really went anywhere else. To Svetlana, he had always remained that same neighborhood kid she'd known since his early years. Quiet, a bit odd, but harmless overall, or so she thought. In their lives, he wasn't just a neighbor, he was practically family. When Yulia was giving birth to Miroslava, it was Vashchenko who ran to his sister to call an ambulance. He chopped wood, hauled water from the pump, helped around the house. He did the things that always need doing in the private sector when there aren't enough hands. Svetlana often let him stay overnight. She'd set up a bed in the closet, feed him, feel sorry for him. That pity, as it would later turn out, would play its own role in this story. And with Miroslava, he played so sweetly that the grandmother could only smile. She would later tell journalists, Mira called him, she wasn't afraid of him, she was drawn to him. At 2 years old, you don't run background checks on the people around you every day. You simply trust those you see, those who smile, those who pick you up. The family didn't know everything about him, but what they did know should have given them pause. They knew something wasn't quite right with his mind. There was documentation from the psychiatric clinic. They knew about the epilepsy, though he'd never had a seizure around them. And the documentation, well, lots of people have documentation. They knew he'd been incarcerated, but the details would only surface later. Back then, he was just Seryoja, a neighbor, one of their own. That evening, Vashchenko approached the gate intoxicated, bottle in hand. Svetlana smelled it immediately and told him to leave. Not welcome in that state. He seemed to comply, turned around and headed toward his sister's house. Seemed to leave. Miroslava's uncle and Vashchenko stood in the yard for a while longer, talking about something. Mira ran around between them, as usual. Then the uncle gathered himself and left on his own business. Vashchenko called out to the grandmother that he was leaving too, and that she should keep an eye on Mira. Svetlana didn't think anything of it. Sergei often did this, showed up, lingered nearby, then left. She went inside the house. She needed to sort through the vegetables she'd picked, tidy up the things her granddaughter had scattered around the room. She set aside some cucumbers separately for Sergei. Let the man have something to eat. That was her attitude toward him. Even after she'd sent him away, she still thought of him, felt sorry for him. Those few minutes, maybe 5, maybe a bit more, were enough to change everything. When Svetlana came back out to the yard, the first thing she noticed was the silence. Mira's voice was gone. The yard was empty. She called out again. Silence. She rushed to the gate. No one. ran toward the river, not quite understanding what she was doing or why she was going that way. Came back, circled the yard, looked behind the house. Nowhere. She screamed for her son. Miroslava was gone. For the grandmother, these weren't just words. She had left her granddaughter for a few minutes in their own yard, and the child had vanished. At that very moment, Vashchenko appeared from around the corner, walking calmly, unhurried, coming from the direction of that same abandoned house. The grandmother would later recount, "That fool comes walking up. He's shoving something at me and I say to him, 'Where is she?' He says, 'I don't know.' He hadn't left. He'd been there the whole time. Said he was leaving but went nowhere. He appeared from exactly where he shouldn't have been. But at that moment, no one thought about it. There was no time for that. They started searching. Svetlana ran in circles, shouting Mira's name. The uncle returned and joined the search. Vashchenko walked alongside them, offering help. He was everywhere, suggesting where to look, calling out. From the outside, nothing suspicious. At that moment, Vashchenko's behavior suddenly changed. According to the uncle's testimony, which he would later give in court when they approached the abandoned building, Sergei began acting strangely, became agitated. He rushed forward, then back, and then suddenly shouted, "She's there!" and bolted, not toward the abandoned house, but in the opposite direction, toward his place, toward his sister's. The uncle chased after him. The abandoned building stood just a few dozen meters from Svetlana's property. Miroslava was found inside. Svetlana screamed. The uncle screamed too. The grandmother would later say her granddaughter was still alive at that moment. Neighbor Mysara called the ambulance. Emergency services arrived within minutes. They found the child with severe injuries and signs of assault. Miroslava was rushed to the hospital. While doctors fought for her life, Vashchenko was detained in his sister's home. He didn't resist. On the way to the station, he made a confession. Said that after Mira's uncle had left, he'd taken her behind the abandoned house, assaulted her, and then, realizing she was no longer breathing, left her there and went home to his sister's. Later, he would recant this confession, but it had already been recorded in the official protocol. Miroslava did not survive. She passed away at the regional hospital several hours after arriving. The cause, severe trauma incompatible with life. An official statement was released, charges were filed, and Chapayevsk was left reeling. But before we continue, who was Sergei Vashchenko? On paper, he was a registered patient at the psychiatric clinic and had a record of epilepsy. On paper, he'd served time. On paper, he'd assaulted a minor before. Not on paper, he was the neighborhood handyman, kind of slow, a bit strange, harmless. When police began their investigation, his biography opened up, and it turned out to be the kind no one on Kooperativnaya Street wanted to know about. He'd been convicted before, for assault on a minor. Not once, but twice. Both times he'd served time. Both times he'd been released. Both times the information was not made publicly available. Under Russian law, such records are expunged from public access. Neighbors aren't informed. No one puts up notices. A person who committed violence against children can move in next door, and you won't know until something happens. This is exactly what happened on Kooperativnaya. Vashchenko returned after his release, moved in with his sister, started helping neighbors with chores, and everyone forgot or never knew why he'd done time. After his detention, another detail surfaced. His sister Natalia, who housed him and defended him for years, told journalists that Sergei had done time _quote_for_. According to her version, it was she who had committed an offense, but Sergei took the blame because she was a mother. She didn't specify what offense or when, but that story, whether true or false, became part of his image. A convenient legend, one that painted him as a victim of circumstance, someone who suffered for family. And when anything suspicious arose, that legend worked like a shield. And a year before the tragedy, something else happened. Something that should have been the final warning. About a year before August 11th, exact dates aren't given in sources, an incident occurred that could have changed everything. Local resident Mysara, the same neighbor who would later call the ambulance for Miroslava, told REN TV journalists the following. Her daughter came home and said directly Vashchenko had been lurking, waiting at a specific spot, probably in those same passageways between properties. He wasn't hiding. He stood openly. Mysara's daughter sensed something was wrong and immediately told her mother. If even she was able to articulate it, Vashchenko's behavior was obvious enough that only someone who didn't want to see could miss it. He was scared off. No details available, but the outcome was the same. Nothing happened. Nobody went to the police. Nobody warned Miroslava's family. The incident faded away. Like everything else had, a direct signal that this man was lurking near children in the bushes between houses. And even that wasn't enough to prompt action, because he was, quote, 6, because he was Seryozha, because, quote, 7, remember? A year later, Miroslava would follow him obediently, and he would lead her to the abandoned house. This could have been stopped. According to KP Samara, Vashchenko had been showing up at the house on Kooperativnaya for 3 days straight, August 9th, 10th, and 11th. It started with a celebration. On the 9th, the family was celebrating Yulia's birthday, Miroslava's mother. They celebrated at home. As usual, relatives gathered, neighbors, some acquaintances, and among them, Vashchenko. He wasn't formally invited, he just dropped by, as he always did, and no one was surprised. The celebration went on. Family acquaintances would later claim that relatives had been drinking, not just on the birthday, but the days after, too. The family categorically denied this. Miroslava's aunt insisted that Yulia was an exemplary mother who'd received an award from the city administration. Who was telling the truth is hard to establish, and for the case it wasn't decisive. One fact is indisputable and documented. On August 11th, Yulia went to work. At home were grandmother Svetlana, the uncle, and Miroslava. Vashchenko was next door, as he had been yesterday and the day before. 3 days in a row he'd spent near this family. He saw Miroslava, saw who left when, who stayed, how the household schedule worked. Was he acting spontaneously, or by then did he already know exactly when and how? The context speaks for itself. He didn't burst into someone else's life. He had been inside it for a long time. Everything that happened next is already known. Svetlana Noznikova wept in front of journalists openly, without shame, without choosing her words, saying what she thought, unfiltered, without trying to protect herself. I know it's my fault. Why did I have to go pick up the things my granddaughter scattered? I could have brought her inside first, then cleaned up. 5 minutes. She blames herself for 5 minutes, for going into the house to tidy up while Miroslava played in the yard, as she'd done 100 times before. This will stay with her for the rest of her life. But it wasn't about those minutes. Svetlana didn't get distracted out of carelessness. She felt no threat. Sergei had left. She'd sent him away herself. The yard was familiar. The street was quiet. She lived in a world where there was no danger. She had built that world herself, for years. She believed his story about his sister. With every gesture of kindness, she convinced herself he's safe. It was that trust, not 5 minutes in the house, that destroyed everything. Shortly after learning what happened to Miroslava, the grandmother collapsed. She sank down right at the doorway. Sobbing turned to hysteria. A funeral home employee gave her water. Relatives called an ambulance, gave her sedatives. Svetlana couldn't stand on her feet. She had lost her granddaughter and knew from the first second that she bore some responsibility. Not because she got distracted, but because she trusted someone who should never have been trusted. She never articulated it that way. She put it more simply, why did I have to go pick up those things? Thinking about things is bearable. Thinking about trust is unbearable. The Samara public organization Right to Happiness learned about what happened from the news. They came to Chapayevsk to help the family, raised money, brought supplies. But then they saw how the family lived and turned around. The organization's director, Marina Fedotova, said the house was in terrible condition, unsanitary, roaches. Volunteers stated that the family knew about Vashchenko's criminal record and still let him in. They demanded that the grandmother and mother be held accountable. Fedotova put it directly. The fact that the grandmother herself let into the house a person with such a biography is obvious. They don't deny it themselves. From that moment, public opinion split. Some expressed condolences, raised funds. Others asked, "How could you leave Miroslava near someone whose criminal history you knew perfectly well?" Miroslava's aunt responded, quote, 13. She insisted everyone was clean, fed, well-groomed. Quote 14. There was no simple answer here. Photos of the yard without a fence, with open access to the abandoned building, were confirmed by screenshots from Yulia's own social media from May 2024. The conditions were difficult. But can you judge a family for poverty, for naivety, instead of the one person responsible? Instead of one front against the man sitting in pretrial detention, two fronts emerged. And while they fought each other, Chapayevsk prepared to say goodbye to Miroslava. On August 14th, everyone came to say farewell. The ceremony was held in a small church on the grounds of the city hospital, the same one where she spent her final hours. The organization was handled by Ekaterina Kosteleva, owner of a funeral agency in Samara, completely free of charge. She told what others kept silent about. Preparing Miroslava for the viewing took a long time. Heavy makeup was applied to conceal the marks. On her face, her hands, everything required work. Her face was additionally covered with a veil. Hours of work, all for one thing, so that loved ones could see her one last time. A small pink casket, a white dress. Miroslava's aunt, holding back tears, told journalists, quote 15, quote 16, that was the result of someone spending hours restoring what Vashchenko destroyed in minutes. Not just family came to say goodbye. People came from other neighborhoods, from neighboring villages, people who had never known this family personally. A crowd stood at the church entrance. The grandmother sat by the door. She couldn't stand. When the casket was carried out, doves were released into the sky. She was buried in the city cemetery. The grave was covered with toys, stuffed bears, dolls, toy cars. People brought them for weeks. Miroslava's father came from another city. The aunt recounted, quote, 17 Yulia held it together, but everyone could see her state. The investigation was taken under personal supervision by the head of the investigative committee, Alexander Bastrykin. Vashchenko sat in pre-trial detention, awaiting trial. The investigation lasted about 6 months. He remained in custody. His detention was extended again and again. A psychiatric evaluation was conducted. The result? Competent, fully aware of his actions, even in a state of severe intoxication. He understood what he was doing. The indictment was submitted to the Samara Regional Court. The case was assigned to Judge Elena Firsova. The trial was closed. Due to the nature of the charges, journalists were not allowed inside, but some information leaked out. At the first hearing, Miroslava's mother came from Chapayevsk by bus. She was pregnant, with her 4th child. She told journalists in the hallway, "I'm due any day now." She sat on a bench in the courtroom and waited. Escorts brought Vashchenko in after a slight delay. Picture this scene. A woman who, 6 months earlier, lost Miroslava, sits in the courtroom, pregnant, looking at the one who did this. During the proceedings, a detail emerged that complicated the prosecution's position. The forensic examination did not find direct biological evidence from Vashchenko. Because of this, the expert who prepared the report had to be summoned to court. The hearing was postponed. According to KP Samara, law enforcement insisted that evidence was present and that the assault was committed using objects, which explained the absence of direct biological traces. Vashchenko's defense attorneys exploited every gap, attempting to challenge the expert findings, questioning witness testimony. When it came time for his examination, he recounted things that, according to sources, left those present in the courtroom in shock. Details are not disclosed, closed proceedings, but the witness base was strong. Dozens of testimonies, the grandmother, the uncle, neighbors, police officers, medical personnel, and his own initial confession, recanted but recorded in the protocol. The court moved toward its conclusion. He was granted the right to a final statement, May 22, 2025. Vashchenko stood in the defendant's cage and delivered his final words. He asked to be acquitted, not for leniency, not for consideration of circumstances, full acquittal as an innocent man. Judge Fursova heard the final statement and scheduled the verdict announcement for the same day. The Samara Regional Court delivered the verdict, guilty on both counts: acts of a sexual nature against a minor, concealment of the act, life imprisonment, first 6 years in maximum security prison, then a special regime penal colony for the rest of his life, plus a lifetime ban on any activity involving those under 18. Miroslava's family had been waiting for exactly this. When life sentence was pronounced, they exhaled. But it wasn't a sigh of relief, more like the exhale of someone who hadn't been breathing for a very long time. The verdict returned nothing. Miroslava is gone. Vashchenko listened in silence. Then he was led from the courtroom. At the exit, already in the corridor, passing by journalists, he said, "I don't consider myself guilty." The last phrase, the last mask, not a harmless loner, not a peculiar oddball, not a helpful handyman, now wrongly convicted. A new role, prepared for the next stage, for the colony, for cellmates, for those who will ask, "What are you in for?" That's Vashchenko in a nutshell. A man who spent his whole life picking an image to fit the situation. For neighbors, a poor soul. For the grandmother, a victim of circumstance. For the investigation, innocent. For the court, wrongfully accused. None of these roles was real. The only thing real was what he did in that abandoned building. Now that the verdict has been delivered and the pink casket is in the ground, you can see the full picture. A year before the tragedy, he was lurking near children in the passageways between houses, forgotten. Neighbors weren't told. He served 2 sentences for the same type of offense. Neighbors weren't told. And in the middle of all these warning signs stood one story about his sister and the sentence he supposedly served for her. Psychiatric registration became eccentricity. Criminal convictions became slander. The incident with the other child became a misunderstanding, and every gesture of his now looks different. Not help, building access, not kindness, creating a position from which to act. He tested, he embedded himself, for years. When on August 11th, Svetlana went into the house for 5 minutes, he was ready. The abandoned house was demolished. They came with a bulldozer and leveled it to the ground. The grandmother put up a fence. Yulia gave birth to her 4th child. The guilt lies not in those 5 minutes, and not in the cucumbers. The guilt belongs to the one who learned to turn others' trust into a weapon, and used it his whole life. He had been trusted since childhood, and he knew it. Dear viewers, please, be vigilant about who your children interact with. Thank you for watching. What do you think about this story? Write in the comments, like and subscribe to our channel.